And this is the shift. This is not about helping people solve a problem or get an outcome. We're not adding value by that, but we're adding value by our ability to listen, to reflect, to offer, to create that. It's priceless.
Welcome to the coaching studio. I'm Lyssa, deHart, your host, and today I am thrilled to introduce Elizabeth Crosse, MCC with the International Coaching Federation. She is a guiding light for coaches on their journey to mastery. With over 3 decades dedicated to the coaching field, Elizabeth is a true researcher, practitioner, committed to the evolution of coaching expertise. She is a firm believer in lifelong learning and the power of experience to cultivate practical wisdom, which I really do want to come back to because that just sounds so cool. Beyond her professional accomplishments, Elizabeth embraces life with joy, whether she is running with friends, sharing a laugh with her husband, or honing her culinary skills. Elizabeth, I am so happy to have you here today. Welcome to the studio.
Thank you so much for a wonderful introduction. And as I'm sitting here, I'm thinking, I wonder where our conversation is going to be going
We
today.
shall see. It'll be quite entertaining, I think. I'm looking very much forward to it. I mean, I typically start off with people asking about where was that place in your life? Maybe it was 1 or 2 events that really shifted and created this journey that has led to this moment that you find yourself in your life right now. And I'm curious if there's an event or two that maybe were the precipice of this journey that you found yourself on.
Oh, what a lovely question. And there was something in there about adventure and journey and where I am now, because I've actually been reflecting a lot on this over the past couple of weeks. I think, at the end of the year, we often start to look back and we look forward. And in a strange way, I feel I've almost come back to where I started. And you said 30 years, it's probably a little bit more than 30 years ago.
But nobody's
Um,
counting. Um,
and although it was 3 when I started to teach my teddy bears to read, um, because I sort of come back very much, I think, to my roots in learning and education. And I think I see coaching very much as a learning intervention, and we might talk about that. But I think partly it was my sense of my own journey, and partly coming out of my research and wonderful conversations I've had to fellow coaches. I love the idea of learning. It's almost like the hero's journey. We
yeah.
get a call to action. We start out, we have some people that accompany us along the way. There are those challenges, those falling flat on their faces. There's that learning from experience. And then when we get to that point, there's an invitation to return home. But when we're returning home, we're different and we're changed. So when we come back, this is this whole concept, which we might talk about more about, bringing back more wisdom. And I think I very much sort of see that. And I see not just as coaches, but how we navigate life. It's sort of setting out on series of journeys. And also, I think at times coming and celebrating when we do come back home and catch our breath.
Yeah, it's so interesting as you say that. Well, there was a couple things that showed up for me as you were talking. One of them, though, is that idea that was in the book, and Paulo Coelho, the cannot remember the name of the book off the top of my head, but that idea of we come back to where we began, right? With all this new information and wisdom. And I kind of think in many ways that's that circuitous journey of life that you're talking about. And I think it does take us through different elements. And you had talked about briefly, you touched on the I don't you didn't call it the learning journey of coaching. What did you call it?
So I think it is that whether it's the learning journey of coaching or the learning journey of life. And I think for my coaching journey, there was various things that invited me to that journey. And I started coaching probably around about the same time as the ICF was starting to form, so very early days. And it was the idea of we were all quite pioneers and finding our way. And I have a background in scientific research, in education. I taught, I was in HR, involved in learning and development, and working with senior leaders and senior leadership development. And as part of the development programs, we had this wonderful senior leader development program, and we had some one-on-one sessions together. And in those sessions, I've also got a background in counselling psychology. I was very much drawing on those skills of really, really listening to understand and helping individuals be curious about themselves. But I was very mindful I was not doing a therapeutic intervention. And then at that time, I started to read and find more about coaching. And there was this is what I'm doing. And it just felt, again, I'm going to use this a lot today, it was like coming home. Because the thing I love about coaching, and I see this as a difference to any other way we help, we support others, is this idea of truly working in partnership with people. I think everything else, there's a sort of shifts in, whether it's I've got knowledge power, position power, or, you know, I'm sort of more sorted than you are. There's none of that in coaching. And I just love this idea of partnering with somebody on their part of the learning journey. And I think that's what started me off, and that's what's kept me going.
Yeah. You know, I think a lot of coaches, and I am, this may not be true, so I put this out there with the caveat of I could be wrong. But I think a lot of coaches struggle with this idea of partnership. And I know I've talked a little bit about the difference between participation and partnership, but how do you define coaching partnership?
I really appreciate the way you phrase that about how do I define it, because I think we will all have very different opinions and thoughts and definitions. And, you know, in all my work with people, I say what I'm putting out is just an offer. It's something for you to consider and to sort of take on board. So I put out my definition as an offer to think, does this resonate or not? And almost that very much that is working in partnership. One of the things I sort of love about the sort of the ICF competencies and definition of coaching is actually seeing individuals as experts in themselves. You know, when I come to a sort of a supervision or a mentoring relationship, and I say that now because I made the decision a couple of years ago now that I no longer coach. I just work with coaches on their development. But it's very much coming that the individual I'm working with is an expert in their context, they're an expert with themselves. And my role is to facilitate their thinking. But I think where I perhaps bring a little bit difference in my approach is I'm quite active and I'm quite in there and I offer things. But I need to be able to do that in a way with a real clear understanding that this is not about advice or telling you what to do or even making recommendations, which we might talk about later, but just something for you to consider, to offer. Does this help you perhaps start to think about things in a little bit of different way? And so I think this is this real what's the word? We're both dyslexic, so you'll have to help me sometimes get the words. Is it mutual? I can't say it.
Mutuality.
That's the word.
Mutuality.
That mutuality. Yeah, it's here we go. We're working in partnership, and it's being able to be vulnerable, and that we both hold that. And I'll tell a little story, and then I'll pause. But I I remember working with a coach and we were having a discussion about what it meant to be sort of vulnerable in the space. And I talked about how so often I learn so much from the people I work with. And her thought was, well, no, because they're hiring me as the expert. I'm there to improve their performance. And this way of looking and sort of feeling almost quite uncomfortable. And I think, you've picked up on this. And sometimes I wonder, does this change when we get to different places in our journey? I
I
don't
don't
know.
know. And it's interesting because you had talked about the sort of the idea of coming home, and my experience with the competencies has been the first time I read them or understood them back in the 2000s, it was like I understood them in one way. And then as I came back to them and started really studying them with new experience, I understood them in a different way. And then I went and took like the PCC marker training and I understood them in a newer way, right? And then as I see how the framework holds the power of holding the container of a coaching conversation, I understand them in a completely different way. So it's almost like this spiral that happens. And so I wonder, as you're talking about the mentor coaching client that you're talking about, if it isn't part of the developmental stages of becoming a masterful coach, is that we all go through this stage where we're like, no, I must offer value, versus the value that's intrinsic to being in partnership as you speak to it. I don't know.
Absolutely. And I think it's that shift. And I'm borrowing from somebody else, but somebody described that the first start as we're on our coaching journey is we learn to trust our clients, and then we learn to trust ourselves, and then we learn to trust the process.
Mm-hmm.
And just the way you were describing how you sort of engaged, I think, in different ways. And I think that almost goes back to what I was saying at the beginning about this. It's almost this spiral idea of our learning, that when we come back to sort of look at things, we then see them in a different way, and we can start to use things in a different way as well.
Yeah, I really think that that's been my experience in my own journey with coaching. And so it really resonates with me. And I don't know that I would have known that at the beginning. So for those coaches at the beginning who are hearing this, like, Pshaw, that's nonsense. You may think about it differently in a few years, right? Like leave yourself open to the potentiality of that. I know when you and I had met last year to kind of talk about, just to meet and all of that, we had talked about some of these ideas of coach development. And you had mentioned that there's sort of three areas: this idea of the craft of coaching, the being the coach, and then the art of coaching. And that's what's really showing up for me as you're talking about this, how we come back to it, this sort of spiral experience of development and learning. I'd love to hear more about these ideas and concepts that you're thinking of when you talk about that.
So I'm going to take a deep breath, because
The big answer.
Where do I start? Where do I start? So maybe let me start with what got me thinking about this, because I think as a mentor and a supervisor, so many of the coaches I work with say, so what do I do next for my development? And do you know what? It's a question that I ask myself. And if I'm honest, I think at times I've done some fabulous development things, but there are some things that are absolutely just an absolute waste of money. I think, why on earth did I sign up for that? So that was a curiosity. And this got me into the research. I was just really curious about, how do coaches go about identifying their development needs? Because I wanted to contribute something that could help us think. I'm going to use the word a little bit more critically and more holistically about our development, rather than just thinking I'm going to go and sign up for another webinar, which might be great.
Mm-hmm.
but there are other parts. So that was the initial starting part. So I won't go into the details of my research, but I worked with a lot of coaches and was just exploring their developmental priorities. And what sort of came out were almost three, I'm going to call them developmental strategies. And the first developmental strategy is, I called it the craft of coaching. And this is when we are prioritizing what I'm going to call capability, which I define as our knowledge and our skills and information, more than capacity. And capacity, I mean, my analogy here is, if building capability is like putting more apps on your phone, capacity is like doing a systems upgrade. So this is about, the craft of coaching is about more knowledge and skills. And also there's a more external focus. So that's, this is where, I might want to be going on webinars. I might want to be engaging in getting some feedback on my coaching skills, because, it is like, I'm sort of thinking about, so what's right here? What's the right answer? So that's the first development strategy. The second strategy, which I call the being of coaches, is coaches who are placing more importance. They're prioritizing what I would call building their capacity by looking inwards. So these are coaches that are wanting to do the sort of the deeper work on themselves. They're probably, they might even be engaging in sort of therapeutic practice, or even getting it through doing stand-up comedy or going on a holiday or a yoga retreat. It's that much more a focus on looking inwards, and it's much more the question I'm asking myself is, how am I being with my clients, rather than the craft, which is, am I doing the right thing with my clients? So that was the second perspective. And then what I'm calling the art of coaching are coaches that are prioritizing their development by their work they're doing with developing others. So it's a focus on building capacity rather than capability, but rather than looking inwards, they're looking more outwards. They're reflecting, they might be working as a mentor or a supervisor or a researcher, and they're reflecting on that work. So these are these three strategies. And for me, what I think is so interesting is they're not linear. So one of the things I'm really challenging is idea of, this journey of coach maturity, and also horizontal and vertical development, which at the beginning, 3 years ago, I was absolutely in love with. And now I'm really offering some challenge to something of this, because I don't think it is this linear progression that we start off by thinking of knowledge and skills, and then we move to doing deep work on ourselves. And this is this journey element. It's, where am I now? What am I doing? What do I need? When I mentor coaches that are going for MCC, they quite often go back into the strategies of the craft of coaching, because they need to think about, what does this look like? I've got to do this test. Am I getting it right? If we go and we do a master's or, a sort of a qualification, we're sort of looking at it through this lens. And none of them are right or wrong, but it's just asking yourself the question of, as we start off, where am I right now? What do I need? Is this a time perhaps where actually it's time for me to look outwards and get a little bit of knowledge and skills? Is this a little bit of time for me just to take a pause? And maybe this year I want to do some deeper work. And I think this also comes back to the idea that, only you will know what's right for you, but just of perhaps asking some of these questions.
Yeah, it is, it's so interesting. It reminds me of, well, one, I think everything may be on a spectrum, but I don't believe that it's linear, right? And so like that kind of that up and down of how we move into and out of our understanding of things. And then we have to the way that you had kind of talked about it, that like, how do we use our experience to inform our I would say curiosity or wisdom, right? Like, how do we do that? And I think it is this moving into and out of appreciation and understanding of something. And I think it requires the thing that you're talking about, which is to go, maybe I'm not just going to drink the Kool-Aid on that idea, but I'm going to think about it from different facets and different perspectives to come up with something that really resonates for where I am right now, and then just play with it and use it to inform our curiosity. And maybe we ask questions that are kind of coming from this perspective also. But it also speaks, before I ask this question, would you explain this idea of soft versus hard, this idea of soft thinking? Because it, for me, as you're talking about this, it really speaks to the movement from hard to soft thinking. It's almost like the evolution, whatever that is.
So I think, and again, you're getting my understanding and interpretation. And we
Absolutely.
mentioned just before we came on is by Guy Claxton as a great resource. So go away and read that because you're getting this. But I think sometimes when we're looking at something or a problem directly, we're not able to solve it. We need to come at it in a slightly different way. And I think it was Einstein that said, you don't solve a problem at the level at which it occurs. So I think for me, this soft thinking is this idea of just allowing things to percolate and consider and to explore, and almost like trust your brain. So some of this, and I think maybe let me explain it in so practical. I think, as coaches, when we're working with clients, because quite often I think it's how do we hold the space? Because when we're outside the system, sometimes we can see things that our clients can't or appreciate. And equally, there is something that actually, at times just offering that off is going to be too much of a challenge and they're going to reject it. So, how can we hold the space? How can we invite? How can we come in other ways? So I know you're really interested in metaphor, and it's these ideas, isn't it? It's these soft ways, these creative ways. It's not looking at things directly, but it's just allowing things to come. And I think sometimes it's also having the courage to be uncomfortable in just sitting with the not knowing, sitting with the stuckness, sitting with that stuckness, rather than, that hard thinking, which is getting in and very quickly trying to solve the problem.
Yeah, and I mean, I was doing a little reading around these ideas by Guy Claxton, and this idea of there are multiple solutions. So don't get fixated on one right solution, but rather how do we play with it in such a way that we can invite the multitude of possible solutions. And I think that also speaks to how do we utilize our intuition? Like, it doesn't come from nowhere, it comes from somewhere based on our experiences, but also our ability to maybe read our own physical sensations and our own somatic awareness might really impact that as well. And I think as you talk about this idea of the art of coaching and this sort of mutuality of the development that we get as we're working with somebody else, but we're reflecting back to our own self and then sharing back to the person, and this kind of going back and forth in partnership. And again, like you said, I mean, I could be wrong for somebody else, but what really shows up for me is that willingness to be, well, not be perfect, to not have to know, to let go of my ideas around how I bring value. I think that this comes up in almost every single coaching conversation with people in the interviews lately, this idea of how do I bring value? Because so many people are stuck on that idea. How did you move through that for yourself? I mean, like there's how did you do that journey into letting go and being with people in this different way?
You're asking some really thought-provoking questions. As I think about that, I can actually feel myself getting quite emotional because, do you know what? I think the way I did that was absolutely times when I fell flat on my face. I've got a wonderful supervisor who I've worked with and I stay working with because she really knows me, so we can really do some deep work. And, there was a couple of times when it's like that emergency, when I just, I don't even want to think about it. I just had such dreadful feedback from a client that I just wanted to crawl into a hole and die. But it was those sorts of moments that stopped me in my tracks and made me think about, what am I doing here? And sort of, I think partly sort of like transitioning those, it's about sort of help me sort of, let go of my ego. And at the very beginning of the conversation, I said, I come home because, I sort of come home to education. Learning is such an ingrained value of mine. And the way I've navigated some really, really difficult challenges in my life is to think about, okay, so what have I learned from this experience? Because I think sometimes we don't get what we want, but we get what we need. And I think it was those, some of those sorts of experiences where I realized that, I was getting too attached to being a good coach and for the client to have an outcome and the client to have value. And just being able to start to process that and think about what's the learning. Because my best sessions, I can remember having one client and they came in and we sort of said, this is what to do. And I hadn't even said, so, where are we going to go today? And they started and they talked non-stop for 55 minutes. And then I came in and did an interruption. So I'm going to come in now because my sense was today you just needed to be able to hear yourself think and download. But, I'm mindful we've got 5 minutes because the room was booked by somebody else. So we're going to need to bring the threads together to do it. And, I went away from that session thinking, oh, flipping heck, he must have thought I didn't do anything. It was an awful coach. And afterwards, he said, do you know, that was the best. He said, I've worked with other coaches. That was the best session I ever had. I just so needed. And I think it was sort of falling flat on my face and reflecting on experiences about that, thinking, what is it that I'm really doing here? And I think the biggest gift we can give anybody is our full attention and listening in that way. And it comes this back to, how am I being? And I think this is sort of coming full circle into, part of one of the things we will do as part of our coach development is to take a long, hard look on how are we being with our clients? What's the self-work we need to do to be able to hold that space? And I think, as I say, it probably wasn't just one, but it's these sorts of experiences.
Yeah.
So I don't know if I've answered your question, but I've put some thoughts out there.
I think I feel like it got answered, and I think it's so profound, that idea of how do we reflect on our experiences so that we can really look at this idea of what is if my mindset is I must offer you value, I must get you to a solution, and you come in and what you need is to download for 55 minutes or whatever, and I'm cutting into that and I'm interrupting you and I'm trying to take you into a particular direction because that's what I'm supposed to do. because otherwise I'm not adding value. I miss this brilliant opportunity to hear you. And I think that I think just, I can't remember exactly how you worded it, but it's this being heard is fundamental to having this sense of self and this sense of just being seen by another human being. And I don't think we have enough of that in our lives. And so I think that coaching, I think therapy does this also. Sometimes people really just need to come in and hear themselves speak out loud with a witness. And not that every session would be like that, but that we allow it because it's for the benefit of the person that we're working with, if I'm hearing you correctly.
Absolutely. And as you were speaking, I was just aware that what was coming up for me is perhaps a slight tangent, but how do we define and understand coaching? And each one of us is going to have a different definition for that. And I'm hesitant to go there, so let's not, because what I know about AI could go on a postage stamp. But what I'm very mindful about is the sort of move towards having sort of an app that can almost do and as I say, if I hear like grow as a framework for coaching, I really want to eat my own face. But it's just this idea, we come in, we get, okay, we've got 30 minutes, what's the goal, what's your what we got to, and then that is coaching. And it might be how we start off understanding, but then I think as we get sort of more involved and more curious, our understanding starts to develop and we see it in different ways. But I think that said, there are many, many different ways of understanding coaching. And with all the coaches I'm working with, what I'm saying is there isn't one right way to do this. It's understanding what works for you, what aligns with your values, who you are, and how you work. So even if we're thinking about how am I working with competencies, how do we work with that so you can demonstrate things in a way that aligns with how you want to work. And for me, what's important in all of this is that we are able to articulate our definition and our practice when working with potential clients so they can make an informed decision on whether or not we're the right coach for them. Because some clients might want that coach that is going to come in and go, let me just stop you there. What's your goal? I don't know. But I think this is what's important, is about us having that self-knowledge and understanding that we can articulate our offer. So again, the partnership, we can make an informed decision.
And so can they. Yeah. It's interesting. So what I know about AI is probably a postage stamp. So it's not, I don't know enough about it, but I do think that one of the things that's striking to me is if you are a coach, and this is just my opinion, who specializes in only doing SMART goals or grow goals or something like that, that you're at risk, in my mind, of being out of a job if there's an app that can do the simple, like, what's your goal? What have you done? And just be an accountability partner for somebody to, I don't know, lose 10 pounds or, develop 3 leadership skills. I think that's not, I think that we're going to find that that's not enough as an interaction. If a person can Google it, or if a person can get it from an app that daily reminds them to do something, honestly, I don't know why they would spend $200, $100, $200, $300, $500 an hour to work with you if they can get it from an app. So I think it's a challenge also for coaches who really want to be relevant in the world of human interaction and coaching, to develop, to your point, go into the being of coaching. Like we have to move past the craft of coaching and move into the being of coaching so that we can begin doing our own work so that we can hold a larger space with more curiosity. I don't know. How does that land as I say that?
I'm sort of nodding my head in agreement because I think there's a place for those conversations because it's making some of those things more accessible to a much broader audience. But I think for coaches, if they want to stay relevant, they're going to have to offer something different. And I'm going to make some sweeping generalizations here, but I don't know how it is in the States, but I'm based in the UK. And what I'm seeing here is I think there is a trend very much towards team coaching, that organizations will bring in team coaches because, again, it's more effective for them in terms of cost and benefit. There's also an increase in the sort of internal coach offer. So you've got qualified coaches, but are working within. But where they are bringing external coaches in still is to work with their senior leaders and their managers. And these people are so incredibly capable and able. And when they are dealing with ambiguity, complexity, and so often what they're needing is to have a safe space where they can think and process. And sometimes it's a case of us being able to be a sounding board and offer things back that other members of their team couldn't. That's what they're looking for. And this is all about our courage to be with them and our courage to be stuck with them
Yeah,
as well.
and not solve for them because these people that we're talking about, these people in, at the top echelons of an organization, they're experts already in what they do, or they wouldn't have that job. So they don't need me to come in and tell them how to do that job, because even if I had done that job 15 years ago, 20 years ago, none of my information is relevant for today's environment. I mean, maybe a little bit of it, but they can go read some book from, the 80s if that's what they're really looking for, if that's when I was a CEO. What they need is somebody who can be going back into this idea of, open-minded, willing to look at it from different angles that they would never think of because they're in the soup. I had chatted with somebody else on this podcast last season, and she said, none of us can read our own labels. Right. And I love this idea that in many ways what we offer is that unique perspective of that outside non-attached observation, but with loose attachment to what it is that we're seeing, just sort of like, hey, are you noticing that yield sign right there? Or, look at that. It's kind of like rocks falling ahead. Is that something we should be exploring versus, let me tell you how you need to do it.
And I think, I love the way you describe that. And I think it's also helping them challenge their own thinking. But it's that wonderful coaching relationship, again, coming back to the partner. I'm not here to criticize or to judge, but to invite you just to be curious and to notice and maybe to challenge yourself in that, and having that space to do that. And I think this is this ability to appreciate that there are, there's not often with where we are and the type of problems that these leaders, there is not an answer. And I often sort of say, it's a case of actually not having the answer, but knowing what the next question is you need to ask. As we're sort of moving along the way here. And that is this part of developing that wisdom to appreciate that there are many different views. It's not that you're right or I'm wrong, but how can we hold all of this space, and sort of take all of this thinking to come out with the best just next step? Because once we've taken that next step, the world is going to change again. And I think, this is these ideas of how we start to be able to develop a greater capacity for managing complexity, which that's quite a tongue twister. So I got that out.
Yeah, and something else that as you're talking has me thinking also is how lonely it can be at the top, because it is really difficult if you are the leader or working for the leader of an organization and you're like, I'm feeling stressed out, overwhelmed, and don't know what to do. Like, who do you get to tell that to?
Absolutely.
I mean, I don't know that I want to tell it to my boss. I've done that a few times and it has gone poorly for me, because they're like, now they're worried that you can't do what you're supposed to be doing. And you have to then explain that you're fine, you can do it. But I mean, it's a whole conversation nobody really wants to get into about where their challenges are showing up. And I think that that's a space of like, I can't solve your challenges. The challenges are what they are. That's the world that we live in. That's the economy. That's the whatever XYZ of your situation. But how will you be in relationship to that experience that you're having so that you have the most capacity, right? Because I think that's what it's about, is having the most capacity to be able to solve my own problem, or at least to navigate these uncharted waters with some ability to do it without constantly tipping my boat over.
And I heard it described as, I love the idea of how we navigate it with grace and equanimity.
Yes.
With that,
I was going to use that word, but I couldn't remember how to say it at that moment. So I'm sorry. No, I'm sorry. I interrupted you, but
no, but and I think that's, and this is the shift. This is not about helping people solve a problem or get an outcome. We're not adding value by that, but we're adding value by our ability to listen, to reflect, to offer, to create that. It's priceless, in having that space for them to do their best thinking. So I think it is about, helping people just stop and be a little bit more considered before they move forward.
Yeah. Well, and I think that is around those soft thinking ideas. Yeah. That we don't come at it with this idea of one right answer. We're not binary in the way that we're thinking about things as the coach. The client may come in binary, but it's our opportunity to be, that sounds a bit binary, as there are only two options available to you here. Or is it that we come in and we, as you know, I love metaphors, play with it metaphorically, or just get curious in our own way about what might be driving that. I mean, I found, at least in my own experience, binary thinking is often coming from a place of fear. So if I don't have any conversation about how would you prefer to be with this, situation, then this kind of, it's this or that, because that's a control issue, right? Like there's two options and I must choose one of the two. How would you prefer to be with this situation? It opens up so many different ways of maybe being for the client. And that's a soft thinking kind of question versus, well, is it A or B? Right.
And, just as I say, just listening to you, and I think you're so right about this fear element. And there's something that we do our best learning. I mean, it's a little just bit, from what I know about sort of neuroscience at 101, is, when our brain is in that sort of fear, sort of, that sort of high anxiety driven, we are not going to be doing our best decision making. It's how can we move into that part of where we can move into that sort of exploratory part.
Yeah.
Where we are in a much better place, where we're feeling centered enough, so we're moving the brain into that sort of different space, out of the need for protect into that appetite for exploration, where our best thinking and best decisions will be.
Yeah, I have not experienced creative thinking coming from a place of threat. That's
Or
just how fast
exhaustion.
can I run?
Yeah. Or exhaustion or overwhelm.
Yeah, yeah. And often the threats often the threats are existential, and so they're not even real tigers. They're paper tigers, but the brain doesn't know the difference. So the brain's still reacting the way the brain reacts. Yeah, no, that's fascinating. And I think so incredibly important. You know, what has been I think we've been talking a lot about how coaches might conceptualize this idea of their own journey through coaching, their own movement through their own spiral with relationship to the work that they do. Is there anything else that you would offer new coaches or coaches working towards maybe an MCC, like you have an MCC and you do a lot of mentoring, that would be food for thought for them?
When you asked that question, I was thinking, oh, I wonder if it's the same thing. I wonder if it's different for new or for more experienced coaches. And what came up for me is be kind to yourself. You are learning. Allow yourself to learn and allow yourself to really enjoy this part of your learning journey, and it will be different. So a new coach may be finding out lots of different sort of knowledge, information with things. An MCC may be finding out more about themselves, but for me, the learning happens from when we get that feeling of being really uncomfortable. Because if we don't have that discomfort, and I'll go off on a bit of a side, because I can remember talking to a client who said she didn't want to make her clients feel uncomfortable, and I was doing a bit of a challenge, because I think we need to feel discomfort to do something different. And for me, that's when we learn. When we're now able to enhance our repertoire to do something differently, we've learnt. Well, if we don't get a little bit of discomfort, then we'll toddle along quite happily, thank you very much, and carry on doing what we're doing. So, both as a coach and mentor supervisor, I always say, I want to be the little bit of grit in the oyster shell, because it's that grit that creates the pearls. So I think the advice is actually appreciate the need just to be kind and allow yourself to learn. But also to appreciate that those times when you are perhaps really questioning yourself, when you're really losing confidence, when you're really feeling stuck, that's when you're learning. And it's a bit of what is it, sort of I can't remember the word now, but you will. When we say, the darkest part is just before dawn. And I think that's that part in the learning.
Oxymoron a bit, I think. Where the struggle is where the growth is.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I definitely feel that has been my personal experience, those times where I felt I know for me, when I was moving from therapy into coaching, there was a point at which I decided, okay, well, I'm not going to do therapy anymore. So I'm going to throw all that, the baby and the bathwater, out of here, not doing that anymore. And then I came into coaching, like I didn't know like I didn't know how to talk. I didn't know how to ask a question anymore. And I've been doing therapy for 20 years. So I mean, and the thing that is, and I think I needed that struggle because I was making a lot of probably often correct assumptions. I was doing it pretty open-handedly, but I would make assumptions about what was important. And so I needed that kind of throwing it out for a while. But I think at some point also, like, how do you bring yourself back in and all the other things that you know, so that you then find a new way of being with people, with a new thing, with a new, well, just a new way of being. For that's probably enough said about that. But that idea that it is so incredibly uncomfortable, and how do we navigate the distress and discomfort so that we can come to the other side, that light at the of the dawn that's now dawning for us. Yeah, I think it's so important, this grace and compassion that you're speaking of.
And I think as well, it's also a reminder about that's how it's going to be for the clients, because they're going to be learning, they're going to have to challenge themselves. Often in coaching, we are reflecting on times when they fell flat in the face, coming back to the point you made earlier, because that's a safe space for them to go, I messed up, I'm really concerned. So again, there's something about how do we hold that space for the clients? And we need to be able to hold that space for ourselves first.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And that's the challenge of continuing to go around the spiral and continuing to come home and meet yourself again and go out and explore some more and come back and go out and come back and go out, a bit like the tides, right? Allowing yourself to move with the rhythm of learning. I have a final question that I ask everyone, Elizabeth. What book or thought leader really was important or impactful to you in your own development?
So I know you were going to ask me that question. I was thinking about it. And again, I think it's the idea that at different times, at different stages, there have been different people. And some of those thought leaders, like I shared at the beginning, that 5 years ago I was really in, and the people talking about sort of vertical and horizontal development and Keegan and things, and now I'm questioning all of that. So partly it comes full circle is that I think there's going to be different things at different times for you. One of, I think, I love Elaine Cox, who is Professor at Oxford Brookes, and her book Coaching Understood, because she very much sees coaching as a learning intervention. So there's a real alignment, I think, with my thinking, and that's a favourite sort of book. I also, at the moment, for people starting off, one of the things I love about Claire Pedrick's work on simplifying coaching is, this is really that value, and for a lot of coaches starting out, that's a real eye opener. But I think with any of these resources or recommendation, again, it's really important to be critical, because with each one of those, there's this little bit about yes, but, and I think the greatest resource is yourself and your willingness to question, and your willingness not to just take sort of what anybody else says. Because I'm often saying, when they're sort of talking about a lot of the gurus, I'm going, well, they've just made it up. So what should what they've made up be any better than what you're making up? It might be, but be curious. So I think the resource I would recommend is your own curiosity.
I think that is absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining and being on the show today. I have very much enjoyed getting to know you a bit better.
It's been an absolute pleasure. And thank you so much for this opportunity to have a wonderful conversation with you.
Absolutely welcome.